It had been years since he last saw them, two tiny lives he had once carried in his arms through a blizzard. He thought they'd be long gone, that the mountains had claimed them. But when the darkness moved in the forest, and two towering shapes stepped into the light, he realized they had been looking for him all along. The wind howled against the mountains like it wanted to peel the skin from his face. Snow swirled in wild, blinding gusts, sticking to his lashes until every blink felt heavy. David pushed forward, leaning into the storm, each step sinking deep into drifts that swallowed his boots to the ankles. His breath came out ragged and white in the freezing air, and every muscle in his body ached from hours of trudging through the endless white. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had planned for a quick day hike, in and out before the storm rolled in. But the weather had turned faster than he could have imagined, and now the mountain was a maze of snow and shadow. His compass was buried in his pack, and even if he found it, the wind shifted so often that direction seemed meaningless. Somewhere to his left, above the roar of the wind, he thought he heard something. Not the groan of bending pines or the sharp crack of ice, but something smaller, high-pitched and thin. He froze, listening. For a moment, there was only the muffled chaos of the storm, but then it came again. A cry. Short, weak. It was almost lost in the gust, but it was there. He turned toward the sound, squinting through the blizzard. The slope dropped off into a narrow gully, the sides crusted with jagged rocks and heavy snow. A line of wind-scoured pines leaned over the edge like weary sentinels. He took a step down the slope, then another, digging his boots in for balance. The cry came again, louder now, urgent. It didn't sound human. The gully bottomed out into a shallow ledge, half hidden by an overhang of rock. Snow drifted heavily against it, but something about the shadows beneath caught his eye. David crouched low, pushing aside a crusted layer of snow with his gloves. The space opened into a small cave, maybe 6 feet deep, the floor uneven with ice and stone. And there, in the farthest corner, two small shapes huddled together. They were barely more than bundles of fur, pressed so tightly against each other it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Their eyes, wide and dark, reflected the faint light filtering in through the cave mouth. He could see their tiny chests moving, rapid and shallow. Bear cubs? David's pulse kicked. Cubs this young shouldn't be alone. Where was their mother? He knew enough about wildlife to understand the danger. An adult bear would defend her cubs without hesitation. But something about the way these two trembled, their fur matted with ice, told him the mother wasn't coming back. The smaller cub lifted its head weakly and let out another thin cry. The sound cut through him in a way he hadn't expected. He'd never been the sentimental type, not about animals, not about anything. But standing there in the howling cold, he knew that if he turned and walked away, these cubs wouldn't last the night. He pulled his pack off, fingers fumbling in the cold. Inside, he had a spare thermal blanket, some rope, and half a pack of trail mix. The blanket was thin, barely enough for him in these temperatures, but it was something. He laid it out on the cave floor, coaxing the cubs forward with slow, careful movements. At first, they didn't move, their fear holding them rigid. Then the larger one inched forward, nose twitching. The smaller followed. David wrapped them together in the blanket, their tiny bodies surprisingly warm beneath the layers of fur. He could feel their hearts hammering against his hands. He knew he couldn't carry them far in the storm, but if he could make it to the ranger outpost he'd passed that morning, maybe 5 miles back, they'd have a chance. The wind screamed when he stepped out of the cave, and snow stung his face like shards of glass. He cradled the cubs against his chest, tucking them under his coat as best he could. The blanket shifted, but he held them tight. Each step felt heavier than the last, his legs burning from the effort. Several times, he thought about stopping, finding shelter and waiting for the storm to break. But every time he looked down and saw the small mound of fur pressed against him, he kept moving. By the time the outline of the ranger station appeared through the snow, David's arms were numb and his body felt like it was running on fumes. He stumbled to the door, kicking it open with his boot. The sudden rush of warm air hit him like a wave. Inside, two rangers looked up from a table, their eyes widening at the sight. "Where? What the hell?" one started, standing quickly. "Found them, in a cave," David managed, lowering the cubs onto a thick rug by the fire. They uncurled just enough to blink at the strangers, their tiny bodies shivering. The rangers were already moving, one fetching towels, the other grabbing a phone. David stood there, breathing hard, snow melting in his hair. He didn't know what would happen to the cubs, whether they'd survive, or where they'd end up. All he knew was that they were alive for now, and that would have to be enough. What he didn't know was that this night, in the middle of a blizzard, had tied him to them in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And years from now, in the dark of the forest, they would remember. The snowstorm that night had buried the mountain in silence. By morning, the roads were blocked, the trails wiped clean. The ranger station became the cubs' first sanctuary. David stayed until his fingers thawed and his breathing no longer felt like glass scraping his lungs. He left before noon, telling himself it was better not to get attached, better not to know. For weeks afterward, he wondered what had happened to them. He tried not to, but every time the wind blew through the pines behind his cabin, he thought of the sound in that cave, the desperate cry, the fragile warmth under his coat. A month later, he stopped by the ranger station. The cubs weren't there. The rangers told him they'd been sent to a wildlife rehabilitation center 2 hours south, where they'd be kept until they were strong enough to survive on their own. No release date was set, but it would be before the next winter. He considered visiting, but something in him hesitated. If he saw them again, if he let himself care too much, it would be harder to let go. So he didn't go. Life filled in the gaps, work, small repairs to the cabin, long hikes in quieter seasons. But some nights, when the forest was dark and the wind low, he'd catch himself listening, half expecting to hear them again. Years slipped by the way they always do, without ceremony. His beard grew streaked with gray, his hands rougher from work. The cabin aged with him, the wooden steps creaking more each spring, the roof needing more patching after every storm. He still hiked, though not as recklessly as he once had. Age, he thought, made you weigh risks differently. It was early autumn the first time something felt off. The forest near his cabin had always been alive with sound, the chatter of birds, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the occasional snap of a branch when a deer moved through. But that day, as David followed a familiar trail toward a small stream, the woods felt still. Not empty, exactly. Just watching. He slowed his pace, scanning the tree line. The air was cool, the smell of damp earth strong after a morning rain. He couldn't see anything, but the feeling stayed with him. Even when he reached the stream and crouched to fill his flask, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Something was out there. By the time he returned home, the sense of being followed had faded. He told himself it was nothing, maybe a cougar passing through, maybe just the shift of the season making the forest feel different. Still, he checked the locks that night. Habit. 2 weeks later, he found the tracks. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud along the edge of his property where the trees grew thick. Too large for a black bear, but not grizzly-sized either. The claws left long marks ahead of each pad. He knelt to study them, his fingers brushing the damp earth. Whatever it was had passed close. Very close. The next morning, he found more, this time circling the cabin at a distance, looping back into the woods. He didn't feel threatened, not exactly. But something about the deliberate path made his stomach tighten. By midwinter, the tracks were a regular occurrence. Always around dawn or just after dusk. He began leaving food scraps farther from the cabin, partly out of curiosity, partly out of some unspoken instinct. Sometimes they were gone by morning, sometimes not. He never saw what took them. Then, one night, the wind carried a sound he hadn't heard in years. It wasn't the high-pitched cry of that night in the cave. It was deeper now, a rumbling growl that wasn't quite hostile, but wasn't casual either. He froze where he stood, just inside the cabin door, listening. It came again, from somewhere in the tree-line. Slow. Intentional. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness in jerky arcs as he stepped onto the porch. Snow had just begun to fall, the flakes fat and slow. He saw nothing. No movement, no eyeshine. But the sound, it lingered. By spring, the tracks were larger. Much larger. He didn't put it together right away. Not until he found the claw marks on the old pine at the edge of his land, deep, high on the trunk, like something tall had stood there and raked down. His mind flicked back to the cubs, small, trembling, barely alive in his arms. Impossible, he thought. Too much time had passed. They'd be far away by now, living their lives as wild bears, no memory of him or that night. But when summer came, and the air was warm enough to sleep with the windows open, he woke one night to the sound of heavy breathing just beyond the wall. Not human. Not close enough to be dangerous, but close enough to be deliberate. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his heart pounding. The breathing moved, slow, around the corner of the cabin, then faded into the forest. He didn't sleep again until the first light of dawn. It was the beginning of something he didn't yet understand, a presence that lingered in the shadows, not threatening, but never far. A presence that, in time, would step out of the darkness and change everything. It was just after dusk when David finally saw them. The summer air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of evening where shadows seemed to stretch slower, darker, as the sun slid behind the ridge. He'd been chopping wood out back, stacking it under the lean-to, when the feeling came again, that quiet prickle at the back of his neck. It was the same sensation that had been visiting him for months now, always without warning. This time, he didn't ignore it. He set the axe down slowly, his ears straining for sound. The woods were still, the kind of stillness that meant something large was close. He scanned the tree-line, the last streaks of light fading into deep blue. Then, about 30 yards away, a shadow shifted, not the wind, not the flicker of a branch. Something big. At first, he thought it was just one. A broad shape, massive shoulders, moving with a slow, deliberate gait. Then another stepped out beside it. His chest tightened. 2 bears. Adult. Larger than any black bears he'd seen in these mountains. Their coats were thick and dark, their eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. They didn't charge, didn't turn away, just stood there, watching. David's first instinct was to back toward the cabin, but something in their posture stopped him. They weren't threatening. They weren't afraid either. They were assessing him. One of them, the slightly smaller, tilted its head, and for a split second, he saw something he didn't expect: recognition. Not the vague, instinctive wariness a wild animal has toward a human, but something sharper. Focused. A memory stirred in his mind, unbidden, a tiny head lifting from a blanket in the firelight, dark eyes blinking up at him through frost. He'd told himself over and over that the cubs would never remember him, that animals didn't hold on to moments the way people did. And yet, the larger bear took a slow step forward. David's hand hovered near the axe handle, not in threat, but in reflex. He could hear their breathing now, steady, measured. The kind of breath that said they weren't here to hunt or scare him. The smaller bear moved alongside the bigger one, their shoulders brushing as they advanced a few feet. David stayed still, his own breath shallow. Every instinct told him this was dangerous: two full-grown bears within spitting distance, no barrier between them. But the longer he stood there, the less it felt like danger, and the more it felt like a meeting. Not an accident. Then, as if on some silent signal, they stopped. The larger bear turned its head slightly, scanning the edge of the woods, then back at him. A low sound rumbled from its chest, not aggressive, more like a deep hum. David didn't move, didn't speak. And then, just as quietly as they had appeared, they stepped back into the trees. The forest swallowed them in seconds. He stood there for a long time after they were gone, the shadows deepening around him, the night sounds slowly returning. It wasn't until the crickets began their steady rhythm again that he realized he'd been holding his breath. Back inside, he sat at the kitchen table with the lantern on, staring at nothing. He replayed every detail, the way they had moved together, the stillness in their eyes, the strange, deliberate calm. If they were the cubs, it had been nearly a decade since that night in the cave. Could two wild bears truly remember a man from so long ago? Logic told him no. Something else told him yes. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every brush of wind against the siding felt charged. Sometime past midnight, he heard movement outside, soft, heavy steps in the dirt. Not close enough to be at the door, but close enough to know they were there again. He didn't get up to look. Not because of fear, but because something in him didn't want to chase the moment away. If they were staying near, they'd show themselves again. He felt it in his bones. And they did. The next few weeks followed a pattern. Days passed without a sign, then suddenly he'd catch sight of one of them through the trees, just a glimpse, always at a distance. A dark shape against the sunlight, or the slow sway of branches as something heavy moved between them. They never came closer than that first night. They didn't need to. It was almost as if they were watching to see if he'd remember them the way they seemed to remember him. One morning, early in September, he found something new. On the edge of the clearing where he split wood, the ground had been disturbed, a patch of dirt turned over, as though something large had dug there. Next to it, a cluster of late summer berries had been placed in a neat little pile. Not scattered, not dropped, but placed. David crouched beside them, the hair on his arms rising. Bears didn't do that. Not without reason. He didn't take the berries. Instead, he left a handful of apples from his small orchard in the same spot. The next day, they were gone, and in their place, a long, pale antler lay in the dirt, still fresh from a recent shed. It was the start of something wordless. A quiet exchange, a trade between lives that had once crossed in a storm and now circled each other in the calm. He didn't tell anyone, not the rangers, not the few friends he saw in town. This was between him and them. But he also knew this couldn't last forever. Eventually, the forest would take them somewhere else. Or they'd disappear into the deep mountains. Or they'd come closer again. And when they did, it would be in the dark. The first frost of the season came early that year. David woke to a thin crust of ice over the water trough, the grass brittle underfoot. The mountains wore a pale crown, and the air carried that sharp, metallic edge that said winter was coming fast. He spent the day splitting and stacking wood, repairing the roof's loose shingles, and hauling the last of his stored apples into the pantry. By the time the sun slid behind the ridge, the temperature had dropped into the low 20s. He lit the fire in the stove and settled into the worn chair by the window, a mug of coffee warming his hands. Outside, the clearing was quiet. The moon was rising, painting the frost-silvered ground with a cold glow. That was when he saw the movement. It started at the far end of the clearing, just a flicker, a shadow crossing into moonlight. David set the mug down slowly, leaning forward in the chair. The shadow became shape. Broad shoulders, slow gait. Then another, just behind. Two massive forms, moving with a deliberate calm that stirred something deep in his chest. They were closer than he'd ever seen them. Close enough now that he could see the steam of their breath in the cold air. They padded to the edge of the clearing and stopped, their dark eyes fixed on the cabin. David didn't move. He didn't even breathe. The larger bear stepped forward first, her paws soundless on the frozen ground. The smaller one, though smaller, was relative. He was still easily 6 feet from nose to tail, followed, his head slightly lower, his steps in sync with hers. They came to within 20 yards of the cabin, close enough that the boards under David's feet seemed to hum with the weight of their presence. For a long moment, they just stood there, watching, breathing. David rose slowly, his knees stiff from sitting. He didn't grab the rifle hanging by the door. He didn't need it. He stepped to the front window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to meet their gaze. The smaller bear tilted his head, the same motion he'd made months ago when they first appeared at dusk. The larger one rumbled low in her chest, not in warning, but in acknowledgement. It was a sound that vibrated in his ribs even through the glass. Then, in perfect unison, they moved. Not toward him. Not away. They circled. Slow, steady, deliberate, padding around the cabin's perimeter. David moved from window to window, tracking them as they went. Each time they passed a patch of open ground, the moonlight caught their fur, making it shimmer like liquid shadow. When they came to the back corner of the cabin, they paused. David opened the back door a crack, the cold night rushing in like a living thing. He could hear them now, the soft huff of breath, the faint creak of frost under their paws. He knew this was closer than anyone would tell you to be with wild bears. But something inside him trusted the space between them. He stepped out onto the porch. The air burned his lungs, but he didn't care. The bears watched him, unmoving. The larger one's ears twitched. The smaller one gave a short, deep chuff, a sound so familiar it made David's chest ache. He'd heard it before, in the ranger station, when the smaller cub had woken in his arms and made that same quiet sound before tucking its head back under the blanket. They stood like that for what could have been minutes or hours. The world beyond the clearing didn't matter. All that existed was the man on the porch and the two shadows in the frost. Finally, the larger bear turned, taking a few slow steps toward the tree lean. The smaller one lingered a heartbeat longer, his gaze locked with David's, before following her into the dark. Their silhouettes faded into the trees until the clearing was empty again. David went back inside, shutting the door gently. He didn't bother with the curtains. If they wanted to come close again, he wanted to see them. That night, lying in bed, he thought about the storm all those years ago, the weight of the cubs in his arms, the way their tiny hearts had hammered against his chest. He thought about the choices we make when no one's watching, the ones that seem small at the time but stretch forward in ways you can't predict. And he knew now, with a certainty that left him restless, that they hadn't just stumbled onto his land by chance. They had come here for him. The frost never fully melted that day. The sun was out, pale and low, but the air stayed sharp, and the ground crackled under his boots. David spent the afternoon mending the fence along the southern side of the property, not because he needed to keep anything out, but because the habit of preparing for winter was carved into him after so many years. By sunset, the cold had deepened. He lit the stove early, letting the cabin warm until the metal pipes pinged softly with expanding heat. Dinner was simple, a pot of stew reheated from the night before. He ate at the table, the lamplight casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The forest outside was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the pines in the wind. It was sometime after 10 when the sound woke him. A deep, steady exhale, close. Too close. He lay still in bed, listening. It came again, followed by a soft scrape against the siding. Not a frantic scratching, but a slow, deliberate movement, like something testing the boundary between inside and out. David eased himself upright, careful not to let the old bed frame creak. The moonlight spilling through the window painted the floorboards in silver stripes. He padded quietly to the far side of the room where the curtain hung half open. And there they were. The smaller bear was standing less than 3 feet from the glass, his massive head turned just enough for the light to catch the curve of his muzzle. Frost clung to his fur in delicate crystals, and his breath bloomed white in the cold. His eyes met David's instantly, no surprise, no startle, just recognition. David froze, his hand resting against the edge of the window frame. He could hear the bear's slow breathing, the faint shift of snow under his paws. Behind him, the larger bear moved into view, her bulk filling the edges of the glass. She stood slightly farther back, watching both of them. The smaller bear leaned forward, his nose almost touching the glass. The warmth from inside fogged the pane between them, blurring his features for a moment before the cold reclaimed it. David found himself holding his breath, unsure if he was afraid or simply overwhelmed. He remembered the first time he'd held him, nothing but a trembling bundle of fur inside that thermal blanket, eyes barely open. The memory felt impossibly close now, as if no years had passed at all. Without fully realizing what he was doing, David reached out and pressed his hand to the glass. On the other side, the bear's breath clouded around the spot, and for the briefest moment, he lowered his head so that the thick fur brushed against the window pane. Then, just as slowly as they'd arrived, they moved away. The larger bear turned first, her paws crunching softly in the snow. The smaller one lingered at the corner of the cabin, his head tilted in that same way, the old gesture that had somehow followed him from cubhood into this moment, before following her into the dark. David stayed at the window long after they were gone, the warmth from the stove behind him and the frost ahead. The glass still held the faint smudge of his handprint. The next day, their presence was all over the clearing. Tracks wove in wide arcs, crisscrossing near the orchard, circling the woodpile. Near the porch, the snow was disturbed in a perfect oval, like one of them had settled there to rest for a while. David knew enough about bears to understand how unusual this was. They were territorial, but these two weren't treating his land as a threat or a resource. They were treating it like part of their range. Like part of their story. That evening, he decided to leave something out for them. Not food, feeding wild animals was a line he wouldn't cross, but something that felt like an offering. Near the edge of the clearing, he placed a bundle of branches from a cedar tree, fresh and green, their scent strong in the cold air. He didn't know if they'd care, but it felt right. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Then, on the 3rd morning, the cedar was gone. In its place, lying square in the snow, was a smooth river stone the size of his palm, rounded by years of water and ice. It had no business being here. The nearest river was miles away. David picked it up, feeling its cold weight in his hand. He turned it over, trying to imagine one of them carrying it in their jaws, setting it down with the same deliberate care he'd seen in them before. It was absurd. And yet, there it was. The visits grew more frequent after that. Sometimes he saw them. Sometimes all he found were the signs, the prints, the disturbed snow, the occasional strange object left behind. A pine cone placed perfectly on the porch rail. A fallen branch stripped of bark lying in the center of the clearing. He began to think of it less as them approaching him and more as them keeping a connection alive. And every night before bed, he found himself glancing toward the window, wondering if he'd see those dark eyes in the moonlight again. It started as a whisper in the wind. A shift in the air, a faint pressure that pressed against David's ears as he stood outside splitting kindling. By late afternoon, the sky was a slab of iron, the light dim and heavy, the kind of stillness that only came before something big. The weather radio confirmed it, an early-season blizzard, moving in faster than expected, with winds strong enough to tear down power lines. David had seen storms like this before, and he knew what they could do. He secured the woodpile with a tarp, latched the shutters, and made one last trip to the orchard to collect what was left of the apples before the snow buried them. By the time he stepped back into the cabin, the first flakes were already drifting down, large, slow, and heavy, like bits of torn paper falling from the sky. Within an hour, the wind picked up. Snow whipped sideways, stinging his face when he cracked the door to check the porch. The world beyond was already losing shape, the trees fading into a white haze. The fire roared in the stove, but the cold still pressed in through the walls. By nightfall, the storm was in full force. The windows rattled in their frames, and the cabin groaned under the weight of each gust. David set a lantern on the table and sat with a mug of tea, watching the snow pile against the porch railing. The power flickered twice, then went out for good, leaving only the firelight to push back the dark. That was when he heard it, faint at first, nearly lost in the howl of the wind. A deep, muffled sound. A chuff. His head snapped up. He crossed to the front window, but the snow was coming so thick that the clearing was nothing but shifting white. Still, the sound came again, closer now. Then movement. 2 dark shapes emerged from the swirling snow, their outlines blurred but unmistakable. The bears. They moved slowly, deliberately, the wind pressing against them, their fur dusted with snow. The larger bear led, her head down against the gusts, the smaller one just behind her. They stopped at the edge of the porch, close enough now that he could see the frost clinging to their whiskers. David's first thought was that they were seeking shelter from the storm. He'd never known bears to come this close to a human dwelling willingly in the middle of a blizzard, but here they were, not pacing, not agitated, just waiting. He opened the door a crack, the wind immediately tearing at it. The larger bear raised her head, her dark eyes meeting his. The smaller bear stepped closer, his paws sinking deep into the drift. David could feel the cold pouring in around him, but he didn't shut the door. "You can't come in," he said softly, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "But you can stay here." It was absurd to talk to them like this, but the words came without thought. He stepped back just far enough to give them space if they wanted it. The smaller bear moved to the side of the porch, settling into the lee of the cabin where the wind couldn't hit as hard. The larger bear followed, lowering herself onto the snow with a slow, heavy motion. They stayed there, pressed close together, their bodies a dark curve against the white. David shut the door but left the curtain open. Every few minutes, he'd glance over. They didn't move much, only shifting when the wind's direction changed. The storm raged for hours, the snow building higher against the porch rail. Inside, David added wood to the stove, the crackle of the fire the only sound besides the storm's roar. Somewhere around midnight, the wind eased slightly. The snow still fell thick, but the world outside seemed softer now, quieter. David stood at the window, watching them. The smaller bear's head was up, his eyes on the cabin. For a moment, David could almost see the cub he'd carried all those years ago, the way he'd tucked his face into the crook of his arm for warmth. He didn't know how long they stayed. At some point, fatigue pulled him under, and he fell asleep in the chair by the fire. When the gray light of dawn touched the window, the storm had passed. The world outside was buried in white. The porch rail was nearly invisible under the snow. The bears were gone. David stepped outside, the snow squeaking under his boots. Their tracks led away from the porch, deep and deliberate, vanishing into the tree line. He stood there for a long moment, the cold biting through his coat, wondering if he'd ever see them this close again. He didn't know then that the storm had shifted something between them, that the next time they came, it wouldn't be just to shelter. The snow stayed deep for days after the storm. Each morning, the world outside David's cabin looked untouched, a perfect white sheet broken only by the steady line of animal tracks weaving toward the woods. He knew those prints, wide, heavy, each with a distinct curve of claws. They came and went from the direction of the clearing, as if the bears were still patrolling the edge of his land even when he didn't see them. The sun returned slowly, pale and low, casting long shadows across the drifts. On the fourth day after the storm, David strapped on his snowshoes and decided to follow the trail. The cold was biting, but the sky was clear, and the air carried the crisp silence that comes only after a blizzard. The tracks led him away from the cabin, down toward a shallow gully. He recognized the terrain, not far from the ridge where he'd found them as cubs. The thought made his chest tighten, though he tried to push it aside. This was their forest, not his. Whatever they remembered, if they remembered, it didn't change the fact that they were wild. The trail curved toward a patch of sunlight breaking through the trees. When David reached it, he stopped dead. They were there. The larger bear was sprawled in the snow, her dark fur catching the light in waves. The smaller bear, though he wasn't small by any human measure, was standing nearby, his head turning slowly as if scanning the trees. Both lifted their eyes when he appeared, and there was no tension in their bodies. No rise in their fur, no shifting of weight like they were preparing to bolt or charge. David took a slow step forward. The snow squeaked under his weight, and the sound seemed loud in the stillness. The smaller bear shifted his stance but didn't move away. The larger bear blinked slowly, the kind of slow, unhurried blink David had seen in the porch light when the storm raged outside. He stopped about 20 feet from them. Close enough to feel their presence, far enough to respect the space. His breath plumed in the air, and for a moment, none of them moved. It was the kind of stillness that seemed to exist outside of time, man and animals standing in the snow, each aware of the other, the forest holding its breath. Then the smaller bear did something David didn't expect. He walked toward him. Not quickly, not with any sign of aggression. Just a slow, steady closing of the gap, each step deliberate. David's heart kicked hard in his chest, but he stayed still. 10 feet. 8. 6. The bear stopped then, his head slightly lowered, eyes locked on David's. The air between them felt charged, not with threat, but with memory. For a moment, David saw him as he had been, shivering in the blanket, the thin cry in the blizzard, the way he had pressed close for warmth. It was absurd to think the bear could recall such things in detail, but something in that gaze told David he did. The larger bear huffed softly, the sound carrying across the space. The smaller one turned his head toward her, then back to David. And then, in a movement so fluid it almost didn't seem real, he dropped his head to the snow and pushed something forward with his muzzle. It was the river stone. The same one they had left for him weeks ago, smoothed and pale against the snow. David crouched slowly, keeping his eyes on the bear, and picked it up. The weight of it in his palm felt like more than just a stone. It was an offering. A connection. Proof of something he couldn't explain. He didn't try to speak. Words felt useless here. Instead, he placed the stone back down in the snow between them, then stepped back once. The smaller bear watched him for another long moment, then turned, padding back toward the larger one. They moved off together, their dark shapes disappearing into the trees. The clearing was empty again, but David stayed there a while, the cold forgotten, the stone's imprint still warm in his hand. When he returned to the cabin, he left the stone on the windowsill facing the forest. Not as a decoration, but as a signal that he understood that the door between them wasn't closed. And as the light faded that evening, he caught sight of two shadows moving at the tree-line, watching. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. David would wake early, stoke the fire, and glance out toward the tree-line. Sometimes he saw them, standing just at the edge of the clearing, still as statues in the morning mist. Other times, there was no sign except for their tracks, broad, deliberate prints looping through the snow as though they'd passed by in the night to check on him. He stopped questioning why they stayed near. The forest was theirs, but it felt as though they'd claimed him as part of it. It wasn't possession, it was presence. That was the difference. They didn't linger for food or warmth. They lingered because, for reasons neither man nor bear could name, they belonged to the same story now. Some days, he left small things in the snow, pine cones, pieces of driftwood from the river, branches with cedar still green. Sometimes, they left something in return, a strip of bark neatly stripped from a branch, a shed claw, once even a set of feathers bound together by a twist of dried grass. He kept each gift in a small box on the mantel, the river stone sitting at the top. It had become a conversation without words. Then, one night, the forest went silent. It was the kind of silence you notice without knowing why, no wind through the pines, no creak of trees shifting in the cold, no distant crack of ice on the river. The absence of sound was so complete it pressed against his ears, making the cabin feel smaller. He sat by the fire, the wood popping softly, every sense alert. He moved to the window. The moon was bright over the clearing, silvering the snow, but nothing moved. No shadows. No shapes. Just stillness. His eyes scanned the tree out of habit, but there was no sign of them. The silence stretched. He considered stepping outside, but something in the air felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but different. The forest was holding its breath. It stayed that way for 3 nights. No tracks. No glimpses at dawn. No signs left in the snow. The clearing felt empty. The absence sat heavy in his chest, stirring an unease he hadn't felt since before the first time they appeared. He told himself they'd moved deeper into the range, maybe to find better foraging. It was what wild animals did. But that didn't ease the knot in his gut. On the 4th night, just as he was banking the fire before bed, he heard it. A low, rolling sound. Not the chuff of recognition, but a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He froze, every muscle tense. Then came another sound, lighter, sharper. A snapping of branches. Heavy footsteps. Something big was moving fast through the trees. David crossed to the window and peered out. The moonlight caught motion at the far side of the clearing, 2 massive shapes emerging from the tree, their breath steaming in the cold. It was them. But this time, they weren't calm. The larger bear's head was low, her movements sharp, scanning the dark like she was tracking something. The smaller bear's body was tense, ears flicking, every muscle coiled. David had never seen them like this. Whatever had kept them away for those 3 nights was here, or close. Then both bears turned their heads toward him. Not for comfort. Not for acknowledgement. It was something closer to urgency. David didn't move. He knew enough to read their body language, and every line of it said the same thing: stay put. The smaller bear gave one short, sharp huff, then both turned back toward the forest, disappearing into the dark with surprising speed for their size. Branches cracked in their wake, and then the sounds faded until the silence returned. David stood there for a long time, the fire at his back, the cold glass under his hand. He didn't know what had passed through the forest, or why they had come so close only to leave again, but the feeling it left behind was unmistakable. Something had shifted. And he had the distinct, unsettling sense that whatever it wasn't over. The morning after their sudden appearance, David woke before dawn. The cabin was cold, the stove's fire burned down to embers. He dressed quickly, layered against the frost, and stepped outside into the pale gray light. The snow crunched loudly under his boots, the sound sharp in the morning stillness. The first thing he saw were the tracks. Not the broad, heavy prints of the bears, those he knew well by now, but something else. These prints were large, almost as wide as his palm, with long claw marks splayed at the tips. They came from the east, cutting across the clearing, and veered toward the ridge before disappearing into the thick pines. Even without a wildlife guide, David could guess. Cougar. And a big one? He crouched near the trail, studying the depth of each impression. The snow had crusted over since it was made, which meant it wasn't fresh. Maybe a few hours old. But the spacing between the prints told him something else. This cat had been moving at a steady, slow pace. It wasn't running. It was stalking. The cougar's trail crossed paths with the bear's prints in 2 places. The first intersection showed the bears moving in one direction, the cougar in another. The second told a different story. The cougar's stride widened there, as if it had quickened its pace, and the snow was churned where the bear's tracks doubled back. David felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. He followed the trail east, toward the ridge. The snow grew deeper there, forcing him to lift his knees high with every step. The prince wove between pines and over fallen logs, always angling upward. Then, near the top, he found something that stopped him in his tracks. A mess of churned snow, broken branches, and deep gouges in the bark of a cedar tree. Cougar and bear tracks tangled together in chaotic loops before breaking apart again. No blood. No fur caught in the branches. Just signs of a sudden, violent encounter. The bears had chased it off. The realization landed heavy. For days, they'd been gone from his land, keeping to the shadows. Not avoiding him, protecting him. Keeping whatever this was away from his cabin. He turned back toward home, the wind picking up through the trees. The sky was changing, the pale gray deepening to a heavier shade, another storm brewing. As he descended the ridge, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. They were there. The larger bear stood halfway down the slope, her dark fur blending with the shadow of the pines. The smaller one was lower, closer to him, his head turned toward David as if waiting. Neither moved aggressively. Neither fled. They just waited until he reached the bottom. David stopped, his breath clouding in the air. "You've been keeping watch," he said softly, not because he thought they'd understand the words, but because the silence between them felt like it needed something spoken. The smaller bear took 2 steps forward, then turned slightly, glancing toward the line of trees where the cougar's trail had gone. It was the same kind of gesture he'd seen before, deliberate, intentional. Then, without a sound, both bears moved off together, disappearing into the forest. Back at the cabin, David stood on the porch for a long time, scanning the tree line. He thought about the years since that night in the cave, about how their paths had crossed again and again, about the strange exchanges of objects and moments. It wasn't just memory. It wasn't just survival. Somewhere along the way, something had changed between them. That night, as the wind began to pick up and the snow returned, David kept the curtains open. If they came again, he wanted to see them. But more than that, he wanted them to see him there, still watching, still listening. The snow fell hard for hours, erasing the tracks in the clearing. By midnight, the world outside the window was nothing but white and shadow. Then, just as his eyes began to grow heavy by the fire, the silence broke. A low chuff, close to the porch. David's head lifted instantly. He stepped to the window, and there they were, both of them, standing in the snow no more than 15 feet away. The smaller bear's breath steamed in the cold, his eyes catching the reflection of the firelight. The larger one stood slightly behind, her head low, scanning the trees. They stayed there for several minutes, unmoving. Not approaching. Not leaving. Just holding the space, as if to remind him they were still near. And then, just as quietly as they'd arrived, they melted back into the dark. The snow was deep enough now that the trees wore heavy crowns, their branches bending low over the forest floor. The cougar's tracks had vanished days ago, buried under drifts, but David still felt the shadow of its presence in the way the bears moved, tighter circles around his land, less lingering at the tree-line, more scanning of the woods before stepping into the open. That night, the wind returned. It wasn't the howl of a blizzard, but the restless sigh of a storm waiting for its moment. The fire in the stove glowed steady, throwing warm light across the cabin walls. David sat in the chair by the window, mug of coffee cooling in his hand, eyes fixed on the clearing. Just before midnight, the forest went still. It was the same unnatural stillness he'd felt before, the kind that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. He set the mug down without looking away from the glass. The moon was high and cold, casting silver over the snow. Shadows shifted at the far end of the clearing. Two dark forms emerged. They moved with the same deliberate calm as always, but there was something different tonight. The larger bear's head was low, her shoulders tight, like she was guarding. The smaller one followed close, but his eyes didn't scan the clearing. They locked on David's cabin from the moment they stepped into the open. He rose from the chair, crossing to the door. The cold hit him like a blade when he opened it, but he didn't care. He stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking softly under his weight. The smaller bear's breath steamed in the moonlight. He took a slow step forward, then another. The distance between them shrank until David could see the frost clinging to his fur, the dark wetness of his nose, the glint in his eyes. They were the same eyes he had looked into years ago, in that cave, when the world outside had been nothing but snow and danger. The same eyes that had looked up from the safety of a blanket by the ranger's fire. The bear stopped at the edge of the porch, close enough that David could have reached out and touched him. Behind him, the larger bear waited, her gaze sweeping the tree-line. She was watchful, but not for David, for something else. And then David heard it. A low, guttural sound from the woods beyond the clearing. Not the deep chuff of a bear. Not the call of a deer. Something sharper, colder. His chest tightened. The cougar. The smaller bear turned his head toward the sound, his body tense. The larger bear shifted, her weight settling into her back legs. For a moment, David had the insane urge to step off the porch, to stand with them in the clearing. But instinct and common sense rooted him in place. The sound came again, closer this time. A flicker of movement in the shadows between the trees. Then, silence. The larger bear moved first, crossing the snow in long, powerful strides toward the tree-line. The smaller one followed, but after 3 steps, he stopped and turned back to David. They held each other's gaze for the length of a breath, 1 heartbeat, then 2. It was the same look from years ago. Not fear. Not farewell. Just recognition. As if to say, we're still here. Then he turned and disappeared into the dark after her. The forest erupted, the crashing of branches, the heavy thud of paws, a sharp, guttural snarl. The sounds moved deeper into the trees until they were swallowed by the night. David stayed on the porch long after the noise faded, the cold gnawing at his fingers, the moon sliding lower in the sky. Finally, he stepped back inside, closing the door with care. He added a log to the stove and sat in the chair again, staring into the fire. He didn't know if he'd see them again after tonight. The forest was wild, and life didn't promise reunions. But if this was the last time, he knew it was enough. They had come back. They had remembered. And in a world where memory so often fades, that was something worth holding on to. Weeks later, in the first thaw of spring, David found the stone. It sat in the exact center of the clearing, pale and smooth, untouched by mud or meltwater. The same river stone. He picked it up, turned it over in his palm, and smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't about happiness so much as understanding. Whatever the years brought, they would always find him. In the storm. In the silence. In the dark.